I'm the Cinderella caught in the eyes of a rich man's son. The young stepmother of the rich man's son invited me to meet. I'll give you 20 million. If you break up with my son. How much is your son worth? I bought into it, watching her eyes light up. A flat rate of 10 million. Deal, I'll break up with him. This is the typical story from movies. Cinderella captured by a rich man's son. Actually, there's a script you have to follow. First, you need to work part-time to cover your studies. You need to tie your hair back in a ponytail. Keep your face plain with no makeup. You also need to buy a deliberately worn-out short-sleeve top and a pair of faded jeans. Carry a large capacity backpack that you've used since high school all the way to college. Since childhood, I've strictly followed the Cinderella script for myself. My father had an accident at a construction site. My mother remarried into a good family. My grandmother raised my younger brother and me. As long as I married early, I could support her old age and pay for my brother's schooling. Luckily, under the community committee's urging, my grandmother let me go to school. Just after I completed 9 years of compulsory education, she pointed at my nose and yelled, "You foolish girl, scheming day in and day out. Study, study, what's there to study? Aren't you just going to get married to serve your husband's family? Stop studying, let your brother continue. I have a naturally rebellious spirit." She didn't let me go to school, so I got into a top high school. With my first place exam score, she pulled strings to get my brother into high school, so I reported it to the Education Bureau. In the end, my brother was expelled. I became a drifter on the streets. Grandma, furious, kicked me out of the house. One day, she called me back home again, suddenly treating me with the best food and care. When I eavesdropped, I realized she had taken money and was planning to marry me off to someone in the countryside. I ran away for the next 3 years of high school. I stayed on campus and never went home. My younger brother turned rebellious, picking up bad habits from an early age. His mouth was full of curses. At 10, he'd already become the edgy, non-mainstream leader on short video apps. He'd wait outside my school every day, demanding money from me, thinking he was the little emperor of the family, that everyone should serve him. The summer after the college entrance exams, he severely injured someone in a fight. Grandma secretly gave him money to help him flee. Within seconds, I walked in with the police. Grandma fainted from crying, and when she woke up, she sat on the bed, grabbing anything nearby to throw at me, screaming at me, calling me a worthless burden, asking why I hadn't just died. I held my acceptance letter in my hand, grabbed my suitcase, and left. Looking at Grandma's tear-streaked face, I couldn't help but feel like laughing. While you're sick, I'll send your precious one to jail. I won't die. And neither should you. You need to watch me become rich. And I won't give you a single cent. At 18, with a promising future in hand, I made this solemn vow. Once I started college, I met plenty of wealthy people. Some were domineering little princesses, some were the extravagant rich second generation, and some were ambitious, talented heirs. And then there were the nouveau rich who spent money frivolously whenever it pleased them. My roommate, Li Xingxing, a classic rich girl, was the typical dumb but wealthy type. She took pleasure in humiliating me daily. She'd often glance over at my closet, giving me a scornful look, asking, "Can't you wear something nicer?" Till I got a scholarship. She laughed out loud in class, saying, "Oh, you know He Yang? She's always running to the teacher's office. Who knows what she's up to, going there so often?" Well, we don't dare to ask. And we don't dare to talk. The moment that stands out the most was when my takeout got stolen, and Li Xingxing saw me talking to the delivery person downstairs by the dorm, crossed her arms and said, "Look at them. What a pair of shameless lovebirds." I never paid her any attention because I figured that one day I'd find a use for her. In an attempt to flaunt her social superiority, Li Xingxing introduced me to a high-end party as a part-time server. Dressed in her sparkling evening gown, she mingled effortlessly among the elite, toasting drinks back and forth. Meanwhile, I was in an ill-fitting black and white uniform, serving her wine with a tray in hand. My plan was to quietly finish the job, take my pay, and leave. But the moment I saw Yuan Yi walk into the hall, I immediately changed my mind. The Cinderella is always clumsy, carrying drinks, and accidentally spills wine on the young master's suit. But don't call her brainless. After all, she managed to bump into him with perfect precision. The most distinguished young man at the entire event. The event organizer fired me on the spot. Li Xingxing glared at me, then twisted away, distancing herself. But the young man whose suit I had soiled did not get angry. He lowered his head, staring at me. "What's your name?" I put on my most wounded look, let two tears fall, and ran off. Don't worry, my blind prince. One day, you'll see me again. After the event, Li Xingxing never gave me a kind look again. Every day, she scolded me, saying she had only tried to broaden my horizons. And I even managed to ruin that. Can't do anything right. She'd say completely brainless. Well, I certainly saw things more clearly. I had once thought that in this world, only a blind prince could fall for Cinderella. I didn't expect that even a blind princess could fall for a poor, pretentious guy. That very night, the captain of the school's basketball team came to find Li Xingxing. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught sight of them kissing in the restroom, tasting forbidden fruit. The beautiful evening gown of the little princess was being touched by the sweaty hands of that immature boy, fumbling all over her. I took out my phone, secretly recording this shocking act of the princess. New semester, new vibe. Every student organization president on campus discovered an anonymous email in their inbox. They unzipped the video, and a whole new world unfolded before their eyes. Rumors spread like dandelions, blowing into every corner of the campus. The whole school now knew about Li Xingxing's heroic exploits with the basketball team captain. Eventually, Li Xingxing dropped out and went abroad. On the day she left the school, she was fully covered, wearing a baseball cap and mask, like a frightened bird, afraid someone would recognize her. Even then, she still didn't forget to order me to carry her luggage. I smiled and asked, "What's the name of your new school?" She scoffed, "You wouldn't have heard of it even if I told you." I reached up, pretending to adjust her messy hair, but in the next second, I yanked off her mask. "No matter where you go, I promised everyone around you will receive that email." Under the scorching sun, Li Xingxing trembled, her gaze blank as she looked at me. Then suddenly screamed, raising her hand high, ready to hit me. People nearby stopped and turned to watch her. Soon, her parents, embarrassed by her outburst, got out of the car and dragged her away. Only one tall, slender man leaned against their car, not looking at Li Xingxing, but fixing his gaze firmly on me. His eyes were a bit dangerous, with a hint of hostility. A chill ran down my spine, and I lowered my head. I'd seen him in Li Xingxing's phone before. He was her older half-brother. I could hear Li Xingxing crying hysterically to her parents, but it seemed that even her closest kin didn't believe her. No one would believe that I had ill intentions, because standing there, naively helping with the luggage, I looked so honest, so innocent. Poor, dear little princess, you're used to throwing money around to humiliate people, but you don't realize that for someone as penniless as I am, the best revenge is through the internet. Yuan Yi was even blinder than I'd imagined. He genuinely seemed to like me. From Monday to Friday, I worked part-time at a cafe, and he'd sit there for entire afternoons. On weekends, I worked as a cashier at a convenience store, and he'd come by every day, clearing the shelves, buying everything but never taking it with him, leaving the snacks for me. He'd lean on the counter with both hands, looking up at me, and say, "Why don't you just be with me? What future do you have working these jobs? Be with me and I'll give you money." But I was still that Cinderella who thrived through hardship, firmly refusing his charity. I picked up his bank card and threw it to the ground, snapping, "What do you take me for? I don't want your money." Yuan Yi, furious, grabbed the convenience store owner, saying, "Raise her salary. If you don't, I'll report you to the business bureau." The owner was speechless. Naturally, Cinderella knows how to keep people on the edge, but she also has to give a little sweetness once in a while. Yuan Yi got out of his luxurious car to join me at People's Square, handing out flyers. He took off my silly mascot headgear, pushed me to sit down on the side, then grabbed the thick stack of opening ads from my hands. He went from reluctantly handing them out to actively approaching passers-by. He seemed to pick it up without instruction, and soon even learned to say, "Take a look, won't you?" As thanks, I split half of my earnings with him. He looked at me in utter disbelief. This playboy was used to fun and games. This was his first time earning something through his own effort. It was a novelty, but I silently cursed him for his foolishness. Handing out flyers for me? All it did was make me sit there in the sun waiting for him. He could have just pulled me into his car and taken me out for a decent meal. What a fool, but Yuan Yi couldn't hear my thoughts. Instead, he confessed his feelings to me sincerely, saying, "In the future, you should earn money with your own hands. I'll be by your side. Is that okay?" I pretended to be touched, acting like a fool for a moment, then leaned over and gave him a quick peck. A gentle, fleeting kiss, but inside I was gritting my teeth. I'd had enough of the days of working so hard that my hands grew calloused. If anyone dared to ask me to earn money with my own hands again, I'd chop their hands off and grind them to dust. News of Yuan Yi and me spread across campus. Some thought we were mismatched. Others thought it was perfectly fitting. Isn't this just like a drama plot? They'd say the heroine goes through hardships and finally finds her handsome, wealthy knight. Congratulations, congratulations. All the money belongs to the hero, not to the heroine. Why should the heroine have to stay poor? Yuan Yi spent quite a bit of money on me. He'd gift me cosmetics, jewelry, designer bags. I secretly exchanged them all for cash and bought counterfeit versions at a low price. He couldn't tell, because in his eyes, he saw only me. He threw an extravagant birthday party for me. I admit, in 20 years, I'd never been the center of attention like this. Most of the attendees were Yuan Yi's friends, people I wasn't close to, but the atmosphere was lively. I held onto a bouquet of flowers, surrounded by young heirs and rich girls. Someone called a waiter from outside to come in and take photos of us. My gaze fell on the slightly awkward-looking waiter. That was me just 6 months ago. Someone, already drunk, asked loudly if Yuan Yi had booked a room for the night. Yuan Yi pulled me close, telling everyone not to joke around. He leaned down, whispering in my ear, "I'll respect you. Baby, let's wait until we're married." I smiled lightly, saying nothing, lifting my eyes to look at his. But he avoided my gaze. Should I say that Yuan Yi was too serious about me, or that he had something to hide? At night, the pumpkin carriage disappeared. I carried my abundant gifts back to the small apartment I'd rented off campus for the holidays. Around the corner, someone was waiting. When I recognized the face, the joy of the day instantly vanished. "Happy birthday, sister!" The vampire raised a small chocolate cake, the candle's faint flame flickering in the wind. I casually grabbed a watch from the gift bag and threw it at Hien. "Get lost," Hien carefully placed the watch back. "Don't be angry, sis. Today is your birthday. Make a wish first." The weak flame illuminated half of my face. In Hien's pupils, I saw my own malicious expression reflected. My greatest wish is to go back to the womb and kick him to death. I knocked over the cake and turned to walk away. I heard Hien calling behind me, again and again. "Sis, I've changed. I've really changed. 7 years ago, you said the same thing. You said you'd changed. And then you turned around and tricked me into that man's room." Of course, even if Hien had never done these things to me, my desire to kick him to death in the womb would still remain. It seems we siblings were born as hopelessly bad seeds. One day, A sleek car stopped me at the school gate. The driver invited me inside. Mrs. Yuan sent me to pick you up. The mention of Mrs. Yuan made it clear. The day that every Cinderella is destined to face had finally arrived. 3 years ago, Yuan Yi's mother passed away, and his father quickly remarried a young wife over 3 decades younger. Of course, such age gap marriages were hardly unusual in wealthy circles, but I hadn't expected Yuan Yi's stepmother to be so young. As I approached, I saw a woman dressed in the latest understated yet luxurious fashion. She curved her lips into a slight smile, took off her sunglasses, revealing a small, delicate oval face with a smooth, full forehead and beautiful, upturned eyes. Observing me calmly, with minimal makeup, the sunlight reflected in her brown eyes, making them as clear as a lake. She was nothing like the rich, flamboyant wives I had imagined, with bright red lipstick and heavy jewelry. This year, she had just turned 30, with a calm and steady demeanor. But there was still a hint of youthful spirit in her expression. Saying she was in her 20s wouldn't have been far off, as I expected. She got straight to the point. Here's 20 million. Break up with my son. 20 million? I don't believe it. The only heir of the Yuan family can't be worth just 20 million. I stayed unmoved. How much is your son worth? I countered boldly, whether it was my imagination or not. When I said that, a hint of surprise seemed to flash in her eyes, as though she found it amusing. One-time offer 10 million. Alright then, so Yuan Yi isn't worth much. I surrendered, saying, fine, I'll break up with him. Stepmother retorted angrily. Clearly, you don't love him at all. You only love money. I gave an awkward smile. Sis, aren't you the same? Hearing me call her sister, her beautiful eyes flickered slightly, and she extended her hand toward me. My name is Man Jin. I'm Hee Young. Our hands met in a handshake, and I faintly caught a whiff of her delicate fragrance on her fingertips. When I looked up again, she was examining me with a meaningful smile, perhaps plotting something in her mind. I didn't tell Yuan Yi that I had met Man Jin. That weekend, I casually went on a picnic with him as usual. He invited his friends, all from wealthy families, and the group raced their cars along the coastal highway, showing off in every way imaginable. Let me introduce you to a new friend. I stood beside Yuan Yi, looking up to see the new friend he spoke of, and was immediately taken aback. The new friend was staring at me, a slight smile in his eyes. I guessed he remembered me too. We weren't strangers to each other. He greeted me politely. Hello. My name is Su Yan. I suspected he left out half a sentence, that he was Li Xingxing's older brother. I forced a smile. Hello. Yuan Yi was oblivious to my reaction, fully absorbed in his new motorcycle. He and Su Yan decided to race, speeding off down the road, disappearing around the bend. I stayed behind, distracted. What had Li Xingxing told Su Yan? And what might Su Yan say to Yuan Yi? When the race ended, Yuan Yi and Su Yan were laughing happily. Their friends gathered around them, and Yuan Yi didn't notice me standing outside the crowd. He received a message, then set down his helmet and hurried off. His sudden departure from the group was suspicious. I followed him and saw him entering the parking lot. A girl was waiting for him. He grabbed her and pulled her into the car. The girl leaned in to kiss him. He pushed her back slightly, but she leaned in again, and then things escalated beyond control. My heart felt calm, perhaps because I had anticipated this. A voice of curiosity sounded behind me. Someone approached, and when I looked up, I saw Su Yan's profile. He looked down at me. Shall I walk you somewhere? He asked. You can cry in my car if you want, but considering you managed to drive my sister away, I don't think you're that fragile. I turned and walked away, refusing to waste words on someone who looked down on me. I took out my phone and called Yuan Yi. Babe, I'm not feeling well. I'll head back first. Enjoy yourself. He didn't pick up on the hint in my last few words, giving a quick, dismissive reply. The call ended, cutting off the shadow of the girl beside him. As I got in my car, I finally recalled who the girl was. The night of my birthday, she was the waitress who helped us take photos. It seems that young masters everywhere can't escape the grasp of waitresses. I never expected that the first high society event I attended would be through Man Jin's invitation. She chose an elegant gown for me and arranged for a makeup artist to create a beautiful look. Yuan-yi only had one thing to say. I didn't realize you two got along so well. That makes me feel better. And then he vanished without a trace. Man Jin's cold fingers rested on my shoulder, and she whispered, "A man who wants to run can't be kept, no matter how hard you try. The only thing you should learn is how to drain every ounce of his worth." Okay, her words were blunt enough. We shared a knowing smile through the mirror. At that same moment, Yuan-yi, dressed in formal attire, was hurrying away from the ballroom. Su-yen grabbed him at the doorway, gently reminding him, "There are only 10 minutes left. Your girlfriend is waiting for you." Yuan-yi looked frustrated. "I know, but my friend ran into trouble at the bar. He really needs me. If you leave now," Su-yen gave his final warning, "there's no turning back." Alright. I'll explain everything to Yang later." Yuan-yi ran out of the venue. He was off to save his new Cinderella. After all, he's the all-powerful Prince Charming, and rescuing one Cinderella after another from her plight is his inherent duty. Su-yen stood still, unmoving. 2 seconds later, he touched his nose, and as he lowered his head, a faint, sly smile curled on his lips, subtle and laced with a hint of malice. He had warned his friend. Once he walked out that door, there was no turning back. He had done his duty. Man Jin and I entered together, searching the entire room for any sign of Yuan-yi. To no avail. Man Jin remained calm, but I could hear her softly gritting her teeth, muttering curses. I figured I'd be left alone for the evening, but in the next moment, someone's arm gently encircled my waist. In the blink of an eye, I was swept into the dance floor. Su-yen gazed at me lazily, the lighting casting an alluring glow in his eyes. "For the length of this song," he said, "you belong to me." Yuan-yi and I were already teetering on the edge of a breakup. In an attempt to win me back, he went and did something catastrophically foolish. He brought my grandmother, whom I hadn't seen in years, all the way from thousands of miles away to his house. Grandmother, naturally thrilled, didn't forget to bring along my brother. He and Tio share in the good fortune. Then, right in front of both families, Yuan-yi proposed to me. The family I'd spent 18 years escaping from was now dug up and paraded around by him. He held my hand, vowing, "I will definitely marry you." Yuan-yi, this brainless fool, living in his own romantic fantasy world, overlooked not only my self-respect, but also his 70-year-old father's furious, dark expression. The old man was on the verge of fainting. Grandmother was ecstatic. "My dear granddaughter, say yes, quickly." I looked at Yuan-yi with a gaze growing colder by the second. Even as slow as he was, he finally began to realize something was off. Man Jin, who had been watching the entire scene, cleared her throat and stepped forward. "Alright, everyone must be tired today," she said calmly. "Such an important matter should be discussed after everyone's had some rest." The old man, grumbling angrily, ordered Yuan-yi to follow him into the study. Man Jin leaned lazily against the sofa, glancing at my grandmother, and remarked it must have been exhausting, coming all this way with the whole family. "Oh, it's no trouble, grandmother replied. "I have this one granddaughter, and of course I want her to live a good life. My precious granddaughter, if she marries into this family." Man Jin cut her off with a slight smile. "What are you saying? Yang is indeed your granddaughter." Man Jin raised his voice in surprise. "How perfect she is! A young woman, well-mannered, wise and understanding. Could she really be your grandson's match? And do you even look at what your grandson is like?" The grandmother, furious, began to throw a fit. I watched coldly, as if looking at a stranger, feeling neither shame nor sadness. Man Jin, just as angry, stood up, crossed his arms, and berated the old woman. I'm telling you, go back where you came from. I'll even give you some money, it'll be enough for your later years. But stop bothering Yang Yang, and don't think he'll help you raise your grandson. Go home and pray. Maybe light some incense for your grandson, and hope he doesn't stay disabled. Both vampires were then thrown out of the Yuan family's gates. I thanked Man Jin, but a simple thank you wasn't enough to express my gratitude. Man Jin held my hand, Yang Yang. As long as you're on my side, helping you is worth it. He wanted Yuan Yi, the Yuan family's last descendant, to be completely broken off. Watching his much older husband, 3 cycles his senior, halfway to the grave, he refused to let anyone compete with him for the inheritance. I was officially done with Yuan Yi. Saying goodbye to my first blind prince, I returned to school dorms just like before, wearing my ordinary, small leather shoes, bathed in moonlight. But this time, my heart felt fuller, because my wallet was fuller. He, however, still wouldn't leave me alone. He waited at the school street corner, and as soon as he saw me, he came up and grabbed my shoulder. His eyes widened, staring straight at me. He shouted, I need to go to school. Give me money, give me money. Even curse him out. A figure rushed forward, grabbed him, and started beating him. I watched coldly as Suyin knocked he into the ground, kicking him again and again. He begged, I'm his brother. I'm his brother. Foot paused, and he turned to look at me. I turned away indifferently, opened the car door, and got in. Suyin delivered one final kick to Heian, not holding back. Heian lay curled up on the ground, crying out in pain. I felt no pity for him. Even if he ended up a beggar on the streets, my heart would remain unmoved. I only hated that he refused to leave me alone. Suyin drove me away, and I asked him, why are you here? I heard you broke up, so I came to find you. He was straightforward. I spent the night at a hotel. The next morning, Suyin was at my door, knocking, seeing the breakfast in his hand. A voice flared up inside me. I'd already met my second blind prince, but for some reason, I dismissed the thought. I didn't want to describe him that way. You're too attentive, I said. I slipped into my jacket in the bedroom. Isn't that a good thing? The doorbell rang again. Suyin went to open it. Just as I was about to walk out, I suddenly heard Yuan Yi's voice. He greeted Suyin. Brother, I just saw you. So early, who are you here to see? Suyin paused and shot back at him. What are you doing here? I'm in the room next door. Last night, I was with Zitia. Hey, call your sister Shu. Let's all go out for a meal together. It's hard to imagine. Last night, Yuan Yi, with his beloved, Cinderella, was lying in bed together. Yet right before he fell asleep, he sent me a voice message, begging me sadly to come back. Suyin's tone was laced with sarcasm. Didn't you just break up? Clearly, he intended for me to hear that. Yuan Yi sighed. Yang Yang's heart changes to fast. I really don't understand him. Suyin, mocking, asked Yuan Yi with feigned confusion. Do you understand? Understand him? I don't understand either. Suyin drew out his words, his tone tinged with an inexplicable, almost teasing warmth. I stepped out of the bedroom, peeking around to look at Yuan Yi. Hi, I greeted. Yuan Yi's face fell instantly. Suyin stood leaning against the doorframe, watching with amusement, his raised lips unable to hide his enjoyment. Just then, the door of the room across opened, and the Zitia Yuan Yi mentioned sashayed out. A pretty, unfamiliar face. Not the one who'd been kissing him in the car last time. The young lady patted Yuan Yi on the shoulder. Big brother, let's go eat. I raised a hand, waving goodbye. Bye-bye, don't let us in breakfast. Suyin chuckled and gestured for Yuan Yi to leave. Yuan Yi left, fairly at odds with Suyan, and hating me even more, regretting he ever found me, his detestable Cinderella. Little did I know that the very next day, I would once again cross his path like an uncheckable ghost at the Yuan family banquet. Man Jin took my hand and walked us up to Yuan Yi's father. In a calm yet meaningful tone, he announced, "I'm officially making Yang Yang my sister." The old man was thrilled, partly because Man Jin had him completely charmed. Whatever Man Jin wanted to do, he fully supported. On the other hand, by becoming Man Jin's sister, I was finally cutting all ties with his son. Yuan Yi was left dumbfounded and soon stormed off in a rage. The old man was so angry he was practically fuming, calling him an ungrateful son. Because of me, Yuan Yi's image in his father's eyes dropped sharply, and his trust in him plummeted. This was clearly what Man Jin wanted to see. That night, Yuan Yi went to a bar, drowning his sorrows, where a sweet, innocent-looking girl approached him. One thing led to another, and she ended up helping him to a hotel. Little did he know she came with a plan. That night, he was barely conscious, and she took plenty of pictures. The next morning, when he sobered up, she demanded 50 million. He didn't have that much money, and was too scared to ask his family. He eventually had to rely on Man Jin to resolve it. I stood at the hotel entrance, watching him clutching his coat, scurrying behind Man Jin in sheer panic. It suddenly hit me. He truly was a complete coward. What good was he, anyway? He resented me, calling me a manipulative woman. My bad reputation spread far and wide, but I still kindly reminded him that issue wasn't over yet. She wanted to extort him for even more money. He refused to believe me until I showed him surveillance footage of someone staking out his family's doorstep. The panic on Yuan Yi's face was evident. He had no money and no brains to solve the problem, so his panic was inevitable. I reached out my hand, gently cupping his cheeks, and reassured him, "Don't be afraid. Your father is upset lately, so why don't you go away for a while to avoid the heat? As for things here, I'll ask Man Jin for help to take care of it for you." It was like he woke up from a dream, staring at me in a daze. But my card has already been cut off. I smiled. "It's okay. I saved all the money you gave me before. I'll arrange for someone to send you cash. That way, your father definitely won't find you." Then he hugged me tightly, genuinely moved. I gently patted his shoulder. "I truly wish you well." And so, Yuan Yi slipped out of the country in fear and secrecy. I didn't hide any of this from Man Jin, but he seemed to find my actions rather meaningful. "Who told you to do that?" I wasn't planning on making him disappear. After all, the old man only has one son. It turns out he was so soft-hearted after all. He'd prefer his son as far away as possible, ideally never to return. Otherwise, I can't think of any way to help you. Do you really think he loves you more than his own flesh and blood? I couldn't help but ask loudly. Man Jin's gaze wavered. Silence fell between us. When he looked at me again, there was something different in his eyes. Perhaps he thought I was too ruthless. I didn't try to hide it. I was determined to press hard on his softer spots, to make him realize I would never be a puppet under his control. I wanted to be his equal. He was too merciful toward Yuan Yi. I decided not to tell him that the money I sent to Yuan Yi was just a pile of blank paper, and I arranged for him to share a room with a bunch of depraved old men working as waiters in a sleazy bar. If he likes waiters so much, then let them serve him well. I hadn't seen Suyan for quite some time. I realized I wanted to see him, so I went to see him. The receptionist in the lobby of his company treated me coldly, clearly looking down on me. Before long, Suyan came down to the lobby. He was holding his coat, looking weary, as if he'd been pulling all-nighters at work. When he raised his eyes and saw me, he raised an eyebrow slightly. He put his hand on my shoulder. "What are you doing here?" "Waiting for you," I turned to face him, glancing at the embarrassed receptionist. Who else would I be waiting for? Soo-yeon had been very busy lately, so busy he'd practically forgotten about me. In her world, protecting her wealth came first. Her mother was the daughter of a well-known entrepreneur who had married for love, but lost half her fortune in the divorce. Her father eventually remarried. She had a younger half-sister born from her father's remarriage. Her name was Lee Xingxing. It turns out, like me, she resented the family she'd been raised in for so many years. So when I drove Lee Xingxing away, he found it amusing. I could help him benefit without lifting a finger. The first thing I did as an adult was to change my surname. Soo-yeon shared his past with me as if it was nothing. "I've told you everything. Aren't you going to say something?" He liked staring at me with a steady, piercing gaze and a hint of ambiguity in his eyes. I shook my head. What's there to say? The rich each have their sorrows. The poor are all the same. That night, Soo-yeon drove me back to school. At the school gate, she wouldn't let me out of the car, holding my hand and asking me to sit with her a bit longer. I looked at her profile for a while. "If you're tired, just go home. If you hug me, I'll be revived." I opened the door, stepped out, and walked away. After a few steps, I suddenly heard Soo-yeon call out, "Oh, by the way, Lee Xingxing is coming back next week." I paused, finding it amusing. One just left, and another is already on their way back. The first thing Lee Xingxing did upon returning was to run into me. Seeing my upgraded wardrobe and lifestyle, he sneered. "Long time no see. Who's your sugar daddy now?" His brother, Lee Xingxing, looked shocked and furious, pulling his phone to call Soo-yeon. "Brother, can you believe?" But he didn't even get halfway through his sentence. All I heard was Soo-yeon cursing, "Don't bother me." And then the line went dead with a beep. "Hey Young, how can you be so shameless? Flirting with everyone?" Lee Xingxing grabbed my collar, his expression shifting through a spectrum of emotions. "Can't even leave my brother alone, huh?" I held back a smile, playing innocent. "Do you have something to say to him? I'm afraid he might like me even more." I added, "By the way, your dear brother told me that rapist got released last month." Lee Xingxing's eyes sparkled, a gleam of malicious satisfaction lighting up in them. "Would you like to see him?" He smiled, a beautiful, twisted smile. "You don't want to see him? Fine, I'll introduce him to my brother first. Everyone has a weak spot. And I have to admit, Lee Xingxing had gotten a lot sharper. He had hit me right where it hurt. I clenched my teeth, frozen in place. He turned and walked away with ease, his arrogant, regal posture practically taunting me, as if saying he would always be the little princess who could toy with me at will. He would always keep me underfoot, never allowing me to rise. After all, he wasn't the one who, at 13, was lured into a 40-year-old man's bed. I stood there, stunned, for what felt like ages. Then, in a near frenzy, I lunged forward, grabbing my phone to call Hee-yeon. The endless ringing echoed painfully in my mind, but no one answered. At 13, Hee-young still believed his brother's lies. His brother said he had changed. He promised he'd never steal from his sister again, as long as she helped him pay off his debt this one last time. From then on, he'd be a good brother, he swore. So, with 200 yuan, she went to help her brother pay his debt. She walked into an old, decrepit apartment building, climbing up a narrow stairwell. That stairwell, like the life that awaited her, was dark, rotten, and filled with trash that no amount of sweeping could clear away. Somewhere, she thought she heard a voice calling to her. "Hee-young, turn around, run." Listening closely, she realized it was her own voice, now, pleading for her. That evening, Lee Xingxing sent me a text message. "I'm taking a guest to see my brother." Moments later, another text arrived. "We're going to eat. Do you want to join us?" Come chat with us over dinner. He even included the address. I hesitated for a long moment, but ultimately decided to go. As I stepped over the threshold, I turned back and put the fruit knife back in my bag. I shouldn't bring a knife. Bringing a knife would be foolish. That would only destroy my future. What I needed to kill was the weakness inside me, the sickening reaction that flooded me. Whenever I thought of that man, I would sever the twisted, deep-rooted hatred and anguish from my heart. With that gone, I would be fearless. I would be truly invincible. I arrived at the location Li Xingxing had sent. I didn't see him. I dialed his number and heard a ringtone echoing from a narrow alley. Walking towards it in the darkness, my steps slowed. As I approached, gradually I could make it out clearly. Amidst the ringing was a woman sobbing and a man's anguished cries. As I reached the corner, I lifted my gaze, and an overwhelming discomfort surged through me. In the cramped alley, under a dim streetlight, Li Xingxing was crying, covering her face, curled up against the wall in terror, unable to move. Next to her, he was also crying uncontrollably, his face bruised and swollen from a beating. The worst of the beating had been taken by the man lying on the ground. He was old now, no longer the powerful force he once was, no longer able to hold me with one hand, dragging me from the doorway to his bed. Su Yan's foot struck him again and again, the man's body flinching like a dead fish on a chopping board. Thankfully, he wasn't dead. I could still hear his pained groans. When Su Yan saw me, he stopped, picked up his coat from the ground. Brushing off the dust, he walked over, shielding my view. He wrapped an arm around my shoulder, nothing worth seeing. I noticed his undershirt was marked with bruises from a club, and his face had a cut on it. His eyes bloodshot. I couldn't speak for a long time, finally asking in a cold voice, "Doesn't it hurt?" Su Yan suddenly laughed. "If you hug me, I'll be revived." My body froze, unable to move. He was calling me sister, crawling towards me sobbing. Enough with the nonsense. Su Yan raised his hand and covered my ears, half pushing, half hugging me as he led me away. I could only hear myself stubbornly asking, "What did they say to you?" "You might not have heard nonsense. It might actually be serious." Su Yan flagged down a car by the curb and told me to go home and get some rest. As he held the car door, he leaned down to look at me. "No one can use this against you anymore." Li Xingxing had even bribed Tian, planning to expose my shameful past in front of Su Yan. But Su Yan ended up giving them a beating, smashing Li Xingxing's phone and kicking it far away. That night, he looked like a carefree delinquent, as if he'd just finished a street fight. Yet he said those words with such sincerity. As Su Yan promised, no one ever tried to use this against me again. Maybe he gave that man some money, enough to disappear without a trace. Or perhaps he used other methods. I didn't know. I was grateful to him. But I hated myself even more for being poor. If I had a lot of money, I could carefully craft an image of myself. A girl with a clean background, sweet-natured, diligent, and understanding. I could pave every step of my future with red carpets and flower petals, presenting myself as beautiful and noble. Instead of, in moments of crisis, relying on the charity of others to save me. Just as I was once again troubled by money, Man Jin called to say, Yuan Yi's father was admitted to the hospital. The old man had finally reached. This day, I could hear a slight tremor in Man Jin's voice. A tremor of joy. He had endured for so many years for this. But then he made a foolish decision to inform Yuan Yi to return to the country. I agreed verbally. The next day, I went to the hospital to visit the old man. He was barely holding on, clearly waiting for his son to return. Man Jin pulled me out of the ward. "Did you notify Yuan Yi? He won't last long without it. Let them meet one last time." I kept silent, thinking, don't let him come back. If he returns, All your efforts over these years will be in vain. Do you really think he won't leave a way out for his son? I took a deep breath, handing my phone to him. Or you can see for yourself. When Yuan Yi's crying at his father's bedside, how much do you think you'll end up with? Man Jin snatched the phone, his fingers trembling slightly. He said in a low voice, "I know what I'm doing," but he didn't sound very confident. He dialed Yuan Yi's number. After a long wait, someone finally answered. Man Jin told Yuan Yi to return immediately. Unexpectedly, on the other end, Yuan Yi replied meekly, "I don't have any money." Man Jin looked at me and said, "I'll transfer it to you now." I kept my expression blank, barely suppressing a laugh. Man Jin hung up, handed the phone back to me. "Yang Yang, I know you mean well, but you really have no regard for family ties." I shrug. In the end, Yuan Yi did manage to return. Yuan Yi got to see his for one last time, but being the brainless fool he was, the moment he knelt down, he began to complain, accusing me of driving a wedge between him and his father, claiming I had deliberately forced him to leave his home. In his final moments, the old man didn't want to hear any of this. But Yuan Yi couldn't stop himself. He got out, "Dad, I didn't mean to. I just wanted to take a gamble back then. I didn't expect to end up in debt. Please forgive me." Turns out he'd been gambling abroad and got scammed, accumulating a massive debt. A fool is a fool, no matter how it goes. Man Jin, furious, slapped him on behalf of his father. With his last breaths, the old man clutched at Man Jin, begging him again and again to help Yuan Yi pay off his debt. And with those words, he passed away. Yuan Yi froze, his face showing none of the grief of losing a parent. Meanwhile, Man Jin's furrowed brow gradually relaxed. He looked at his now deceased husband on the hospital bed, his face eerily calm. Then, he straightened his wrinkled collar. The room was deathly silent. Everyone left behind had their own hidden thoughts. Man Jin stood up, picked up his bag, and walked out of the room. He gave a cold glance at Yuan Yi, who was still kneeling on the floor. "Don't expect me to pay off your debts. Your father left you plenty. Take it and get lost." I leaned against the doorway, watching the scene unfold. Man Jin put on his sunglasses, half his face now hidden. As he passed by me, he whispered softly, "Come over tonight for a drink." I gave a slight smile, sure. Yuan Yi at last belatedly realized everything and began crying, perhaps weeping over the fact that there was no one left to clean up his mess. I stepped forward and patted his shoulder in mock consolation. "You came all this way just to anger your father to death." For the first time, Man Jin and I drank freely in this mansion. She looked relaxed, swirling the wine glass in her hand. Though it's a bit cliched, I still want to say, I've waited a long, long time for this day. This was extraordinarily meaningful for her, and I was willing to listen as she recounted the hardships she'd endured over the years. When my father passed away, my two older brothers split the business completely among themselves. If I hadn't married into this family, I would have lost everything that was rightfully mine. Yang Yang, it's not that we're bad people. We were just forced onto a desperate path, weren't we? She asked, seeking my agreement. I said nothing in response. Yuan Yi took what was left for him by his father and left. I didn't cut him off entirely. Don't say I went soft. She added, I used to be even harsher than you. Maybe I'm just getting old. Man Jin gazed at the wine in her glass, her expression distant, lost in thought. Perhaps it was the lighting, but for the first time, I noticed traces of age on her face. When I settle the assets here, I'm planning to expand my business overseas. Finally, Man Jin extended an olive branch to me. Think about it, would you consider coming with me? For a moment, I was speechless. Or do you plan to stay for Suyan? Man Jin lifted her head, as if she'd expected it all along. I had a boyfriend once, too. Even after I got married, he asked me to run away with him. I lowered my gaze, watching the wine swirl in my glass. I didn't choose him back then. I chose money and now I sometimes regret it. If I'd chosen him and not the money, I'd probably regret it every day. Yang Yang, what would you choose? Yes, what would I choose? Finally, Su-yen and I had our first proper date. Over dinner, I openly shared my past with someone. For the first time, the scars and unspoken memories I thought were long buried. Su-yen didn't give me comforting words laced with pity. He simply listened in silence. Our eyes met. A slight smile in both of our gazes. We raised our glasses. Our pasts weren't easy. We agreed with a quiet laugh. Perhaps that's why we ended up crossing paths on the same track. After dinner, Su-yen took me to the mountaintop to feel the breeze. I used to think mountaintop night views were a rich person's idea of a ridiculous date. But now I realized that standing at the city's peak, looking down at the sparkling nightscape, was truly a pleasure. As long as you weren't stressed about working yourself to death the next day, wrapped in Su-yen's jacket. The night wind messed up my carefully styled hair and makeup. That evening, we ate, chatted, exchanged gifts, kissed, and even had fleeting moments where I felt like crying. It was truly a perfect date. In the end, even the night seemed ready to fade away. Su-yen looked at me. Anything else you want to ask me? If not, I'll take you home. I thought to myself, if there's anything I want to ask, there are actually quite a few things. For instance, Su-yen, if I decide to stay for you, would you be surprised? Would you say you love me? Would you always love me? Would you marry me? Would you help with the household chores? Would you wash the clothes? Would you mop the floors? Would you do the dishes? Would you keep giving me roses? If I got pregnant, would you find me unattractive? If I couldn't work, would you resent me? If we fought, would you throw me out? Would you dare swear an oath? And would you believe it yourself? Can you guarantee you're truly worth me staying for? These questions are trivial and honestly unnecessary because my choice has been clear from the beginning. So I just smiled and said nothing else. I heard that he found a decent, honest job, then heard that he got arrested again for theft. I didn't know, nor did I care. Grandma's mind was already gone, wandering to neighbors' houses in fits of madness. The neighbors talked incessantly, saying her granddaughter didn't care for her, and neither did her precious grandson. The community committee called, suggesting I figure out a way to settle her properly. So I wired over a sum of money. I arranged for someone to take her to a nursing home. That sum of money was enough for her to stay there until her final days, and even enough for her to be buried in a prestigious cemetery afterward. I have no intention of visiting her. Some people say I should reconcile with her before leaving, that I should feel grateful, and let bygones be bygones. After all, without her harshness, I wouldn't where I am today. No matter what they say, she is still my family. No, she never deserves that title. There's no glory in suffering. The only person I owe gratitude to is myself. With everything settled, Manjin also finalized all her assets in the country. Together, we boarded a flight to the other side of the world. As the plane taxied, we casually talked about everything we had left behind. About the people we would never see again. Did Su-yen tell you? Manjin asked. I went to him. I told him I was taking you away, and asked if he wanted to keep you. I shrugged, indicating I didn't know. He said that none of us can hold on to anyone. A couple of days ago, I heard Su-yen got engaged. His fiancée is an heiress, a perfect match for him. I suppose this marriage will bring him considerable benefits. In the future, he'll likely reclaim what rightfully belonged to his mother's estate. That's always been the most important thing to him. I looked out the window, feeling certain in my heart we would all go on to live the lives we truly wanted. Whether it was Su-yen, ambitious and forever prioritizing his own gain, Or Hee Young, doing whatever it took to escape her fate. As the plane lifted off the ground, a sense of unreality filled my heart, and I thought of that last night, the final time I met Soo-yeon on the mountaintop. We exchanged gifts, and the gift I gave him was a hug. You said I'd never hugged you. So here's a hug. My arms wrapped around his waist, my cheek pressed against his warm chest, and I could almost hear the steady beat of his heart. Or maybe it was my own heartbeat. Soon, I let go of him, not allowing myself to linger too much. I looked up at him and asked, "What about my gift?" Soo-yeon smiled and carefully took a square gift box from the back seat of his car, beautifully wrapped. I hadn't expected he'd actually prepared a gift. In silence, I lowered my head, waiting for him to open it. He stood before me, the ribbon fluttering in the wind as he pulled it. Inside the box lay a watch resting quietly. The roaring night wind seemed to stop, and I remember my hair fell still. Even my breathing became silent, unmoving, just like our fates, connected briefly by this intersection, yet ultimately unmoving. You need to be like the hands of a clock, always moving forward, never stopping for anyone. I pretended not to understand. So that's why you gave me a watch? I'm giving you your future. Perhaps he was joking, but I still heard Soo-yeon's quiet, barely perceptible choke of emotion. The end.